On December 1, 1944, the French army massacred many of its own unarmed Allied soldiers at a military base in Western Africa, Camp Thiaroye. The conflicting total numbers of those who were killed ranged from 70 to 300 or more. The victims came from French Colonial African Senegalese regiments, which had actually fought in the defense of France when the Nazis invaded the nation in 1940. Senegalese soldiers were also part of the Free French Army, fighting in North Africa, Italy, Corsica, and subsequently in the Provence landings in France, with the First French Army in 1944. In total, 200,000 men were activated for the Senegal regiments during World War II, and 17,000 of them died. 25 years earlier, 161,000 French colonial Senegalese troops were recruited to fight in the First World War, and many had died in the bloody defense of France during the biggest battles on the Western Front. The men recruited as soldiers for the Senegal regiments came from several sub-Saharan Western and Central African nations. Besides Senegal, the men came from Chad, the Ivory Coast, Mali, Guinea, Benin, Gabon, Burkina Faso, Togo, and the Central African Republic. The Senegalese regiments were first organized in 1857 by Napoleon III. At the start of World War II, in 1939 and 1940, the German Nazi troops were carrying out mass executions of soldiers taken prisoner in Poland and in France. Over 100 British prisoners were exterminated in two such instances. Black African colonial soldiers taken prisoner by the Nazis were routinely targeted for executions. From May to June, in 1940, 1,000 African prisoners were murdered by the German army. One slaughter saw 50 wounded African prisoners of the 24th Senegalese Tirailleurs Regiment, massacred on May 24, 1940, at Aubigny. Further major atrocities took place in June, where African regiments fought while defending French towns and villages against Nazi attackers. In some cases, the Africans were savagely murdered, and there were instances of the Nazis running over the victims' bodies with armored vehicles to make sure they were dead. One such slaughter, 8 white French officers who protested against the executions of their black troop in their own Senegalese regiments, were also murdered in cold blood by the Nazis. Those African soldiers who survived battle and executions became prisoners of war in camps located in France, since the victorious Nazis apparently felt it was repulsive to station the black captives in Nazi Germany. In all, around 120,000 soldiers from all French colonies were taken prisoner by the victorious Germans. 1/5 of these prisoners were from French West Africa. By June of 1944, African prisoners were starting to be freed from the prisoner camps in France, as the Allied forces advanced from the Normandy beaches and forced the Germans to retreat. The Free French Army commander, Charles de Gaulle, had ordered liberated French colonial African troops to be sent back to Africa. At this time, there was a French policy in place, referred to as blanchiment, the French word meaning whitening. The racialized procedure was based on limited recruitment space in the Free French Army, whereby officials decided to only use newly disbanded French resistance fighters, while sending foreign colonial troops out of France and back to their homelands. Upon their liberation from the Nazi prisoner of war camps in France, a group of 1,635 demobilized French colonial African soldiers were first sent to Morlaix, in Brittany, Western France. There, on November 5, 1944, they boarded a British ship, Circassia. They reached the port of Dakar, the capital of Senegal, on November 21, and were then directly transported to the nearby French military base, Camp Thiaroye. 1,280 of the repatriated Senegalese troops were crammed into the base. Problems almost immediately arose when the French colonial African troops being released from service were not being given their full demobilization pay and prisoner wages owing that they were entitled to as French servicemen and veterans. Meanwhile, their French white counterparts were being fully paid. They were offered only half of their expected due military service pay, when French authorities tried to swindle them through a deceitful exchange rate in not making payment in regular French francs, but the lesser valued colonial franc rate. It was a disgraceful act of betrayal that France had tried to impose on their African allies, who had already suffered so much at the hands of the Nazis, during the Battle of France and as their prisoners. One group of the unarmed African soldiers which was supposed to be transferred to Bamako, vehemently protested against the injustice of not being paid what they were entitled to, as veteran French service soldiers. And so, they refused to leave. French authorities regarded this as an act of mutiny, and the situation worsened when on November 28, the French regional brigadier general, Marcel Darnan, visited Camp Thiaroye to investigate the matter. He was detained for several hours by the angry protesters, who were resolved to not leave until they were treated with dignity and paid what was owed to them, after all of their sacrifices for the past 4 years. Soon after the freed French general had returned to his own troops, he launched an act of destructive retribution against the African mutineers, quickly giving orders for a merciless military attack to be carried out against what he claimed to be an open rebellion. Early in the morning of December 1st, at 6:30 in the morning, the French commander's attack against Camp Thiaroye commenced, using local French National Gendarmerie personnel, 3 companies of local colonial Senegalese troops, an artillery regiment, supported by several armored cars and an M3 Stuart tank. Reports vary regarding what took place in the hours after the assault began. The witnesses' versions were different from the French authorities' official report that was issued the next day. French officials claimed a knife was drawn by the mutineers, and that the rebels had opened fire on the troops. Witnesses claim the French assault force fired first, which instigated a massacre that lasted moments. The slaughter itself started just before 10 o'clock in the morning, several hours after the assault on the camp had started, while the unarmed mutineers were gathered in the courtyard area of the base. General Darnan's report claimed that altogether, 70 rebels were killed. Some witnesses estimated between 300 to 400 of their comrades were slaughtered. The bodies of the victims were unceremoniously buried in an unmarked mass grave that has yet to be discovered. Widows of the victims received no compensation nor the pensions that were owed to their dead husbands. In 1945, 34 of the surviving protesters who were accused of initiating the protests were subsequently convicted of mutiny and jailed in sentences ranging from 1 to 10 years. The trials were a disgraceful sham, typical of the acts of reputed cowardly state officials, acting in denial of their own corrupted practices. In this case, French officials were covering up their own crime of mass murder. The unjustly convicted men were later pardoned by the French government in 1947. However, they were not actually acquitted, and this resulted in the loss of their army pensions. For decades, French officials were successful in largely suppressing this horrific story of the betrayal and mass murder of their African allies. And so, these 34 African veterans, and their fellow surviving comrades, who fought to defend the French nation and who had escaped being victims of summary executions, and survived in Nazi war camps, and massacres ordered by a French general in an African nation, received nothing that their saga of sacrifices were owed.